Jack Thompson had always dreamed of a peaceful retirement, a life away from the chaos of the modern world. After serving in the Navy for over 3 decades, enduring storms both at sea and in life, he finally found what he thought was his own little paradise. It was a small, picturesque island off the coast of Florida, untouched, serene, and full of natural beauty. The moment Jack stepped foot on that land, he felt a sense of belonging, as if the wave had carried him home after years of restless wandering. This wasn't just an island. It was a promise to himself, a place where he could live out his remaining years in tranquility, fishing by the shore, listening to the rustling palm trees, and waking up to the soft call of seabirds. Jack had seen enough battles in his life. Now, he wanted nothing more than to rest, to finally enjoy the fruits of his labor, to bask in the warmth of the sun, without worrying about the troubles of the world. He built a small wooden cabin, designed to be simple but sturdy, much like the man himself. He imagined growing old here, enjoying quiet mornings and peaceful evenings, far removed from the noise and interference of city life. Little did he know that his battle days were far from over, and that the biggest fight of his life was yet to come, not against an enemy with weapons, but against a system that believed power and money could trample over individual rights. One evening, after returning for a short trip to the mainland to stock up on supplies, Jack's peace was shattered. As his boat neared the shore, something felt wrong. The once pristine landscape of his island had changed. The golden sand was now scarred with deep marks, as if heavy machinery had invaded its quiet existence. And then, as Jack stepped onto the shore, he saw it, a massive row of solar panels, stretching across his land like a foreign army that had taken over without firing a single shot. There were at least 172 of them, large, metallic, and utterly out of place. Jack felt a sinking feeling in his gut, a feeling he hadn't felt since his days at sea, when a storm was brewing on the horizon. Who had done this? How had this happened? This was his land, legally purchased and rightfully owned. He had spent his life fighting for his country, believing in the values of freedom and personal rights. And yet here he was, watching as someone had simply taken what was his. Anger bubbled beneath the surface. But Jack had learned long ago that anger alone never solved problems. He needed answers. He needed to know who had the audacity to steal his land without so much as a conversation. Jack wasted no time. He made a few calls, spoke to the local authorities, and finally got his answer. The Homeowners Association from a nearby luxury resort community had installed the panels. According to them, they were part of a community energy initiative, and since Jack's island was technically close enough to their jurisdiction, they had taken the liberty of using it for what they called the greater good. Jack couldn't believe what he was hearing. They had never contacted him, never asked for his permission, and yet they had the nerve to claim that his land was now part of some environmental project. It wasn't about green energy. Jack had no issue with solar power. In fact, he had planned to install a few panels of his own for his cabin. But this wasn't about sustainability. It was about control. The HOA had found a loophole, an old zoning law from decades ago, which allowed unclaimed or underutilized lands to be used for community projects if they weren't properly registered as private residential property. Jack had done everything legally, but because his land was in a gray area of maritime law, the HOA saw an opportunity and seized it, assuming an old Navy man living alone wouldn't have the resources to fight back. Jack wasn't the kind of man to back down. He believed in fairness, in doing things the right way, and so he decided to confront the HOA directly. Dressed in his usual no-nonsense manner, he arrived at the resort's board meeting, where decisions about his land had been made without him. The room was filled with polished executives, men in expensive suits who barely spared him a glance. Jack introduced himself, explained the situation, and asked for a fair resolution. But instead of admitting their mistake, the HOA representatives dismissed him with patronizing smiles. One of them, a particularly smug man named Richard Caldwell, leaned back in his leather chair and smirked. "Mr. Thompson, you have to understand, progress sometimes requires sacrifice. Your island was sitting empty, and we thought, why let it go to waste when it could serve a greater purpose?" The arrogance in his voice made Jack's blood boil. They didn't see him as a rightful landowner. They saw him as an obstacle, a small inconvenience in their grand plan. Another member chimed in, suggesting that Jack could be compensated. if he just agreed to let the panels stay. But it wasn't about money. It was about respect. It was about the principle that no one, no matter how powerful, had the right to take what wasn't theirs. Jack left that meeting knowing one thing for certain. This was war. Jack considered his options. A legal battle would take years and drain his savings. The system was designed to exhaust people like him, to make them give up before they even had a chance to fight. He consulted a local lawyer, a sharp-witted woman named Lisa Monroe, who confirmed his fears. They're banking on you not having the resources to go up against them. You could fight this, but it won't be easy. Jack appreciated her honesty, but giving up wasn't in his nature. He had fought battles before, not just with weapons, but with strategy. He didn't just want to win. He wanted to teach them a lesson they wouldn't forget. He thought about what they had done, about how they had used a loophole against him. And then it hit him. If they could use nature against him, why couldn't he use nature against them? He didn't need lawyers or lawsuits. He needed something much stronger, something that had been fighting back against human arrogance for centuries. He needed trees. Jack had spent time in a different part of the world during his service, and he remembered an ancient reforestation technique he had once learned from indigenous tribes. Certain trees and plants, if planted correctly, could grow rapidly and block out sunlight within weeks. He did his research, carefully selecting fast-growing species like bamboo and native hardwoods. Then, using the very money the HOA had offered him as compensation, Jack hired local workers to help him plant rows and rows of trees all around the panels. He worked tirelessly, his hands in the soil, his determination growing with every sapling he placed into ground. The panels had been built on his land, assuming he would do nothing, but they had underestimated him. Within weeks, the trees began to grow. Within months, they formed a dense, towering barrier. Sunlight, the very thing the solar panels needed to function, was now blocked by a wall of greenery. The HOA had expected him to roll over and accept their theft. Instead, he had turned their so-called progress into an expensive mistake. The day the HOA realized what was happening was a day Jack would never forget. Caldwell himself arrived, furious, demanding that Jack remove the trees. "You can't just block them like this," he shouted. Jack simply leaned against a tree and smiled. "I thought you believed in the greater good." Jack had won the first round of his battle, but he knew the fight was far from over. The HOA wasn't the kind of organization to take a loss lightly, especially when it came from a single man standing against their well-oiled machine. Jack had expected retaliation, and sure enough, it came swiftly. Within days of his tree planting strategy taking effect, he received an official notice from the HOA, claiming that his actions were obstructing a vital community resource and that he was now violating zoning regulations. It was laughable. These were the same people who had installed solar panels on his land without permission, and now they were trying to tell him that growing trees on his own property was against the rules. But Jack knew what was really happening. The HOA had underestimated him once, and now they were scrambling to regain control. They weren't used to someone like him, someone who didn't just roll over when faced with bureaucratic bullying. Jack had spent his life navigating systems far more complex than an HOA's rulebook, and if they thought he was going to be intimidated by a few legal threats, they had another thing coming. He had already done his homework, and he knew that as long as his trees weren't classified as invasive species, they had no legal grounds to demand their removal. But the real challenge wasn't the paperwork. It was the war of attrition they were trying to wage against him. The HOA's real strategy wasn't to win in court. It was to exhaust him, to make him feel like fighting back wasn't worth the effort. Jack had seen this tactic before, used by powerful organizations against a little guy, and he knew the only way to beat them was to outlast them. Jack wasn't just going to sit back and wait for their next move. If they wanted to play dirty, he was ready to play smarter. He knew that legal battles were costly, not just for him but for the HOA as well. And if there was one thing organizations like this hated, it was bad publicity. So, Jack decided it was time to bring the fight to the public. He started documenting everything, taking pictures, recording conversations, keeping meticulous records of every interaction he had with the HOA. Then, with the help of a few tech-savvy locals who had grown frustrated with the HOA's overreach in their own neighborhoods, Jack launched a campaign. Social media, local news outlets, and even a few national publications picked up the story of the Navy veteran fighting against a corrupt HOA land grab. The response was overwhelming. People who had dealt with HOA nightmares of their own rallied behind Jack, sharing their own experiences, turning his personal battle into a larger movement against unchecked HOA power. Suddenly, the HOA wasn't just fighting Jack, they were fighting public opinion, and that was a battle they weren't prepared for. Investors in the luxury resort community started to get nervous, worried that the negative press would drive down property values. And just like that, the pressure started shifting in Jack's favor. But he knew that public support, while powerful, wasn't enough on its own. He needed a way to ensure that the HOA couldn't simply wait for the media attention to die down before coming after him again. That's when Jack decided to take things one step further. He reached out to an environmental nonprofit organization that specialized in land conservation. With their help, he began the process of having his island classified as a protected green space. If successful, this designation would make it nearly impossible for the HOA to ever touch his land again. It was a long and complicated process, filled with legal hurdles and bureaucratic red tape. But Jack was determined. He worked tirelessly, attending meetings, filing paperwork, and proving that his reforestation efforts were not just a personal vendetta, but a legitimate conservation effort. And the best part? Every step of the process was another nail in the HOA's coffin. The more he pushed forward, the more the HOA's actions were scrutinized by regulators and legal experts. It wasn't just about his land anymore. It was about setting a precedent, about showing that homeowners had rights and that organizations like the HOA couldn't simply bulldoze over them without consequences. Jack knew he was making progress when the HOA started backpedaling, quietly retracting their legal threats and trying to downplay their involvement in the solar panel debacle. But Jack wasn't done yet. He wanted to make sure that this kind of overreach never happened to anyone else again. As the trees continued to grow, blocking more and more sunlight from the solar panels, the HOA's panic became more evident. Their community energy project was turning into a complete failure, and their financial backers were not happy. The power company that had partnered with the HOA started pulling out, unwilling to be associated with a scandal. Without funding, the HOA's grand solar plan crumbled. The panels, once touted as a symbol of progress, now stood useless, hidden behind a wall of green that Jack had cultivated with his own two hands. The irony was not lost on him. Nature, the very force they had tried to exploit for profit, had become their downfall. But even as he watched their plans fall apart, Jack didn't let his guard down. He knew that desperate people did desperate things, and the HOA was running out of options. They made one last attempt to negotiate, offering Jack a hefty sum of money to remove the trees and allow them to use a portion of his land in a revised deal. It was a tempting offer, more money than he had ever expected to see in retirement. But Jack didn't hesitate. He refused. This wasn't about money. It was about something much bigger. He had fought too hard to let them win now, even if it was under the guise of a settlement. His land was his, and no amount of money could buy back the principle of standing up for what was right. With no other options left, the HOA finally caved. They dismantled the solar panels, removed all their equipment, and issued a formal statement saying they had reevaluated their approach to community projects. Jack didn't care about their empty words. What mattered was that his land was finally free from their interference. But he didn't stop there. Using the momentum from his victory, he worked with local legislators to propose new laws that would prevent similar land grabs in the future. His fight had started as a personal battle, but it had become something much bigger, a movement to protect individual property rights from corporate and bureaucratic overreach. And as he stood on his island, watching the last of the HOA's trucks disappear over the horizon, Jack felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Peace. True, hard-earned peace. His land was his again, and this time he knew it would stay that way. Because if there was one thing this battle had taught him, it was that sometimes the best way to win wasn't to fight harder, it was to fight smarter.